Well, good morning. No one responded. Happy Super Bowl Sunday. Yeah. How many Chiefs fans do we have here? Yeah. Well, now we know we're reaching the lost. I'm just kidding. But if at any point in my sermon I do just stumble and fall down, I'm not faking it. I don't know why I would relate that to the Chiefs, but I read a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People this week, so that's why I'm starting who I am. But anyway, our annual tribal fire called the Super Bowl. If you have your Bibles, because we'll talk about that, you can turn to Luke chapter 22. If you don't, there's a Bible beneath the chair in front of you or near you, and the page number on the screen there, page 735, corresponds to that one. I'm going to continue reading from the narrative that Hannah spoke about last week. And it begins here in verse 24. A dispute arose among the disciples as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Now, Jesus has just given what I would contend is the most important picture of who he is, what he came to do, what the kingdom of heaven represents. It was a tangible metaphor that today we refer to as Eucharist or communion, his body in his blood. And the disciples continue to astonish the reader at their ability to completely and totally miss the point. Because their response, according to Luke, to Eucharist is to embroil themselves in an argument about who is the greatest among them. Now, it might be easy for us to read these words and kind of, point fingers at them, or maybe roll our eyes at them in exasperation, or kind of do the face palm thing, and think to ourselves, like, who does this? Like, who has this kind of argument? And while it might be tempting to consider that and sit in judgment on them, the reality is most of us do this. We just may not say it out loud. The 19th century Austrian psychotherapist Alfred Adler talked about this idea that we have an impulse and a drive to be the best that we can be. He spoke about how many of us have an inferiority complex, and so to overcome that, we develop a superiority complex. Now, what he's talking about is not that we strive to be the best that we can be, that you strive to be the best that you can be, but he said an unhealthy impulse that we have is that you strive to be the best there is, that you strive to be the best in direct competition with others. And he observed that this starts sometimes quite innocently from a very young age. I mean, I don't know how many of you grew up with siblings, but especially if you were the younger sibling, you would always have some kind of competition with those with whom you grew up with. Like for me, it was always wanting to measure my height against my brothers. And I'm happy to tell you, I am in fact taller than all of them. Which tells you how short my family is. I'm truly the tallest of the Hidalgo children. Doesn't really say a lot. However, there's something in that. We want to be bigger. We want to be taller. Think about the last time you saw someone do something. Maybe it was at work. Maybe it was a friend. And in your head, you began to draw comparisons between you and them. Think about what we see displayed all over on social media, us presenting a life that's not entirely real. For what reason? Because we want people to think that we're great, that our life is great. And I suppose if I were to ask you, if you were really honest, have you ever compared yourself to other people? A lot of hands would probably go up. Even the way we look at the world in which we live, we talk about this. There's a term that's being thrown around in the sports world all the time that's just like, it's almost lost its meaning. It's the GOAT, the greatest of all time. And you can actually watch people debate, like seriously, passionately debate over who is the greatest of all time. They'll come with stats and everything else and get all worked up about it because we have something in our heads where we have an impulse, a desire to not just be the best we can be, but to be the best ever in direct competition with other people. This is what it seems the disciples are talking about. Now, we don't know the exact nature of their conversation, but whatever it is, it was enough for Jesus to insert himself into it and in some ways course correct them. He says to them, hey, don't be like the kings and those in places of authority in this world who lord their power over the Gentiles, over the nations. Now, this would not have come as a complimentary comparison for the disciples, because to speak of kings in Jesus' day was to remind them of people like Herod the Great, or Herod's 3 sons, all of whom were almost worse than their father. To speak of kings reminded them of the Roman emperor. To speak of those in authority reminded them of the governors of Judea, of the police captains called the centurions that established law and order and put out and quashed any hint of rebellion. To speak of them is to remind them of the people that were busy oppressing and persecuting them in real time. And he says, and some of these people go right on ahead and call themselves benefactors. Now, benefactors were a group of people in the ancient world that were traditionally praised and lauded for what they did. These were people who had a lot of money, people who had a lot of influence and a lot of power. And they would take that and they would use it for civil service. They would use it for the benefit of the city where they lived. They would use it for the benefit of the towns or the countries or the empires. And it was seen as something good. You can read Roman poets where they extol benefactors. Even in the Jewish concept of generosity, benefactors, those with wealth and power who used it for the benefit of others, were celebrated. And Jesus is saying, hey, listen, these people who are competing with one another, these people who want to work their way up, these people who oppress in the way that they rule, those who abuse power and abuse those entrusted to their power, they're going on and calling themselves benefactors, acting like what they're doing is really actually a good thing. It's not who they are. And what's interesting is that Luke wrote this to the church in a time not long after Vespasian was the emperor over Rome. And historians point out that the idea or the misuse of benefactor really came into play during Vespasian's reign. And what they observed is that there were those with a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of influence who started giving money to people in places of political power so that those in places of political power would give them favors, that they would be able to gain more political power and more clout, that they would get their names on buildings, we might say today, that they would be praised and honored. And I know it's really hard to imagine in our context and in our culture, someone with a lot of money and a lot of power and influence who would pay a political official and be given favors that give him more political power. I know it's hard to imagine that, but just try. We call them oligarchs. And that's a better name than benefactors. And Jesus is saying to them, you watch this play out and you know that the favors that they're getting only benefit them, and actually it hurts you in the long run. This is the game you're playing when you're having an argument over who is the greatest. Don't do that. Instead, he says, be like the youngest. Now, we hear the word youngest and we might think about where you fall in the birth order. But in the Hebrew mind, and actually in the Hebrew language, the word for youngest can also be used as the word for least. There's a story about King David when he's anointed king over Israel, and Samuel the prophet goes to the house of his father Jesse, and when he walks in, he sees the oldest son standing there, and it says that he thinks, surely this is the Lord's anointed, and then God says to Samuel, do not consider his height, which again, someone in my stead really likes that verse. And he says, don't consider his height. He says, that's not the one. And Samuel goes through all of Jesse's sons, all of whom have an imposing figure and an imposing stature. And God says no to all of them. And so then he says to Jesse, do you have any more boys? Do you have any more sons? And Jesse says, well, we still have the least. Talking about David. We still have the youngest. And they were called the least because they had the least rights. They had the least claim to the inheritance that was given to them by their father. They had the least power in the family. Everything in their world, they were on the bottom rung. And so Jesus says, when you're arguing about greatness, don't think about the kings and the people who call themselves benefactors. Think about the least. Think about the youngest. He says, think about the servants. Now, many servants in the Roman world that Luke was writing into were bought and sold like property. They were the ones who would come up and clean up after you when you had a party. They were the ones who would cook for you. They were the ones who would wait on you hand and foot. If you were a servant, you were always at the beck and call of the landowner. Jesus says, think about what you've just witnessed with me. He says, you and I both know that when it comes to who is the greatest, if we're thinking just about the cultural pecking order, it's the one who's sitting at the table. And not only the one who's sitting at the table, but the one who's hosting the party, which is exactly what Jesus was doing this night that he was with his disciples. He says, you know it's the one who's sitting at the table that's considered the greatest. But here's the thing, I'm not here to be the one at the table. I'm here as one who's serving you. And you, if you want to be great, imitate that and you'll be well on your way. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in a sermon he preached called The Drum Major Instinct, observed this impulse we have to always be the ones out front, using the image of the drum major out front who's directing the band. And he said, this is not the vision of Jesus. And Dr. King said, anyone can be great because anyone can serve. All that is needed is a heart full of grace and a soul that is generated by love. This is the vision that Jesus gives. It's actually really simple. If you read the teachings of Jesus, he doesn't get into all sorts of complex theological arguments. He doesn't have a long list of things that you have to memorize, and he doesn't talk about how you have to defend your faith and all these other things. The way of Jesus is really, really simple. Love God, love others, serve others. I mean, if you do that, you probably could call yourself a follower of Jesus. But the thing is that simplicity of Jesus' way does not mean it's easy. It's actually tremendously difficult. Because we have to begin recognizing that, yes, we have this impulse to compare ourselves to others. Yes, we have this drive to be the best there is and compete. And Jesus says, yeah, that's not the way. That's not the way it's supposed to go. And so what have we done? Well, we've made the way of Jesus and this whole Christianity thing really complex, but let's be honest, it's pretty easy if we want it to be. G.K. Chesterton says, "The way of Jesus has not been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried." These are the words that Jesus gives to his disciples, and it's only after he gives them the instruction about being the least, about being a servant, that he then says, "I now confer on you a kingdom. I now confer on you authority." Only after he's given them this vision. Now, one of the things I know about the Bible and about stories in the Bible is they all can seem like fantasy. You know, like the fantasy genre where it takes place in another realm, like Narnia or, like Middle Earth or the Seven Kingdoms. By the way, have you ever noticed that in most fantasy films, everyone there speaks with a British accent? Which I think is weird because England is a real place where people actually talk like that. For some reason, if we want them to be from another realm, they have to speak with a British accent. Maybe when you read the Bible, Jesus is speaking with a British accent. I'm not sure. But there's this idea that we look at these stories and it's like, man, that's a really inspiring thing Jesus is talking about. But can we get back to real life? Like, can we get back to the way it is in 2025 here in Denver? Because, the whole serving thing, in the face of what's happening globally in our world right now, in the face of war, in the face of an increased rise of totalitarianism throughout much of the modern Western world, like serving. And in a subtle way, we can almost like divorce ourselves from these teachings and go, yep. They're good in theory. Or maybe it's good when we're all together. But I don't think Jesus understood the world that we're living in. And I think you'd be right to say Jesus probably didn't understand the world that we were living in. But let's not forget what they were up against, with the boot of the Roman Empire firmly on their neck, oppressing them. And one of the things that I began thinking about of these, let's just call them impractical or less than ideal teachings that Jesus often gives, is not so much what happened that night in the room. But what compelled me is, what did these teachings, what did these words of Jesus, what did it do to the hearts of the young men that were sitting around that table with him that night? And what did these words create in the world and in the Christian community that did something in the world? Like, how did these teenagers who were from the backwoods of Galilee, a region that was not really high on the list of respected places in the cosmopolitan empire of Rome, how did these boys create a way of life that eventually became the dominant religion of an empire? And there's a lot of theories as to exactly what that was, but one of the things that everyone recognizes is that, well, first, to say Jesus is Lord and King, you immediately put yourself in the crosshairs of Rome, because that was the title reserved for Caesar. Anything else is seditious. Which meant if you were going to sign on or join with this Christian community, it was serious commitment. It wasn't a country club. You weren't going to buildings with every single creature comfort you can think of. You didn't have the luxury of 1,500 local churches in the Front Range of Colorado to go, let me think about which ones I like best. No, you joined a Christian community under the threat, real threat, of persecution, of oppression, of being further marginalized. There were no free riders. There was no coffee waiting for you when you showed up. It was serious. I find it interesting when I contrast this with experiences that I've had globally and experiences I've had here in the United States. Years ago, I was in Vietnam, where the church is still illegal. Christianity is still illegal. However, because of one of our ministry partners, One at a Time, which is a global clean water initiative, When they got involved with the government of Vietnam and they said, we don't know how we're going to even begin dispersing these filters throughout the country, they said, well, we have an idea, but you're going to have to provide amnesty for the people who are distributing the water filters. And they said, why? They said, well, because it's the church. They're in every village and every town, and you know that. And if you want to get it out there, we happen to know how to connect with all of them, and they can go and provide clean water. And so the Vietnamese government, thinking about their GDP, thinking about all of the money they put toward diseases related to water, thought, okay, fine, we'll give them amnesty. And while we were there, we would go to these different villages, and every single time, people would come out from the crowd with big smiles on their face and give us huge hugs. We were in villages there where they said, hey, just so you know, they have not seen white Americans since the war. And still, these people would come out beaming and give us hugs. And after about the third or fourth time that happened, I finally asked our translator, I'm like, who are these people in every town that keep coming and giving us hugs? He goes, oh, those are the pastors, many of whom have been released from prison so that they can distribute clean water. And we told them that you share a faith in Jesus. That I sat and ate meals with the persecuted church and experienced joy and gratitude and generosity and grace. And I think that has a lot to teach us in the United States, because research actually shows that the majority of white Christians in the United States believe they're persecuted. And I think to myself, I don't think you're persecuted. I think you might be losing some of the creature comforts you've become accustomed to. I think you're losing the fact that you don't have the only microphone anymore. I think you're losing the fact that it's not just about you and what you want. You kind of have to share the platform with other people now. And by the way, if you are persecuted Christians, why are you complaining about it? Jesus said to expect it and said, when it comes, rejoice. We should be having worship services, not asking people in government to protect us further as though we need it. The early Christians said, yes, no, I will join with this community where I know I will likely face death if I am caught. This idea of being a servant, this idea of joining in, was a bedrock for that community. Historians also point to the fact that Christians treated women and children much differently than it was typical throughout the Roman Empire. Throughout most of the Roman Empire, women remained uneducated, most of them. Women were seen oftentimes as kind of property or producers of heirs. They were always relegated to low positions. And a husband could dispense of a wife just as much he would dispense of a pair of shoes before he went and got a new one. And yet, within Christianity, you have Paul writing a letter to the Ephesian church, and he says, hey, husbands, submit to your wives. You want to talk about upending the social order? That there's a lot of evidence in the New Testament and even more in church history of educated women leading churches in their homes and holding places of authority and power within the early church. Of husbands being invited to stay with their wives no matter what, and not to follow the pattern of culture. Of women prophesying in the midst of the church when they were gathered. In Rome, children, they were even lower than women. If a child was born with any defect, it was common in the empire to abandon the child. And you wouldn't bring him to a fire department. You'd leave him on the side of the road. You'd leave him in garbage dumps. It was infanticide. And one of the things that we know about the early Christians is that they would find a child on the side of the road and they would take the child to be their own. There are stories of the Christians going to some of the garbage dumps in some of the larger cities and being quiet and waiting to hear the cry of children. And they would go and find the children and they would adopt them as their own. This is what gives such power to the words that Paul preaches to the church when he says, "You are adopted sons and daughters of the Almighty God." The Christians were on the lookout for the least and the marginalized. And they brought them in as equals. Another thing that scholars observe is that early Christians didn't force you to sever your ethnic ties. You see, in the world up until that point, most people were connected by blood relations. It was a very tribal way of thinking. And all of a sudden, Christianity begins spreading all over the world with different languages, different ethnicities, different cultures. And the Christians said that's fine, which was a major leap forward because no longer was it just that your blood united you, but your beliefs. And this is not mental assent, but your way of life is what united you. This is what connected you. There's one story that I read in particular that blew my mind. And it was that the emperor's young son was having a birthday party, and so they rented out the local arena, and they were going to feed people to wild beasts because that was part of the spectacle. I mean, what a weird thing, be like, "Hey, son, what would you like to do on your birthday? Let's watch people get eaten by lions. You're on." But this is what they did. And there were a group of Christians in that particular city, one of whom her father was begging her to renounce Jesus so that she wouldn't die. But they knew that if they had renounced Jesus and been let free, that there would have been other people, most likely criminals, who would have been fed to the beasts at that particular birthday party. And so not only out of their commitment to Jesus did they continue to honor him as king, but they put themselves in harm's way and ultimately died a gruesome deaths so that these others might live just a little bit longer and hopefully hear the message of Jesus. Maybe more than anything, there were two big plagues that punished Rome in the 2nd century and later in the 3rd century. The first one, many believe, was called the Antonine Plague. Many believe that it was probably smallpox that was brought back to Rome by the Roman soldiers because they were sick on their way home. At its height, it was killing 2,000 people a day. Some claim that over 25% of the Roman Empire perished because of this plague. And one of the criticisms of the wealthy and the powerful that was offered by the historians is that they were all fleeing the major cities and going out to their countryside villas. One famous physician, one famous doctor named Galen, whose medical research actually continued to be taught in universities for 1,000 years after he died, Galen famously fled Rome to his countryside estate and wouldn't let anyone near him. Decades after that first plague happened, a second plague broke out. This time, many believe it was measles. And it was the same thing. The masses died while the rich fled. And in reporting on the second plague, historians say that some of the rich fled, leaving their own family members, even children, who were already sick. And sometimes they abandoned the bodies of their own children and left them out on the street. And as horrific as these two pandemics or plagues were, they had one thing in common. That being that in the midst of people fleeing, it was the Christians, many of whom had means, who stayed to care for the sick and to give people dignity when they pass from this life into the next. Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, started hearing the Christians say, "Why us? Why us?" And this is what he wrote to the church. He said, "Now it troubles some that the infirmity of this disease carries off our people equally with the pagans. As if a Christian believes to this end that free from contact with evils, he may happily enjoy the world and this life. It troubles some that we have this mortality in common with others. But what in this world do we not have in common with others, as long as this flesh, in accordance with the law of our original birth, still remains common to us? What a significance, beloved brethren, all this has. How suitable, how necessary it is that this plague and pestilence, which seems horrible and deadly, searches out the justice of each and every one and examines the minds of the human race. Whether the well care for the sick, whether relatives dutifully love their kinsmen as they should, whether physicians do not desert the afflicted begging for their help, whether the rich bestow and give something. Cyprian's letter went on to say, you're not separate and superior. You're just like everybody else. And if Jesus told us to serve, then we know what we need to do. And in fact, the Christians stayed in the major cities, and they died by the thousands just like the Gentiles did. But they began to make such an impact because of their faith and because of their compassion and because of their humility that it actually angered the emperor of Rome. And the emperor of Rome decided, I'm going to compete with the Christians. And so he wrote a letter to the high priests of Galatia. His name is Julian, and this is what he says. Our religion does not yet prosper as I desire. And it is the fault of those who profess it. For the worship of the gods is on a splendid and magnificent scale, surpassing every prayer and every hope. Why do we not observe that it is the Christians' benevolence to strangers, their care for the graves of the dead, and the holiness of their lives that have done the most to increase atheism? By the way, the Christians were called atheists because they didn't believe in the Roman gods. I believe we ought really and truly to practice every one of these virtues. And it is not enough for you alone to practice them, but so must all the priests in Galatia without exception. I have made a plan to provide you funds for this. I have given directions that 60,000 gallons of corn and 7,500 gallons of wine shall be assigned every year for the whole of Galatia. I order that 20% of this be used for the poor who serve the priests, and the remainder be distributed by us to strangers and beggars. So Julian, just to give you context, created a government program to compete with the Christians because the Christians, with their humility and service and love and compassion, were more influential than the emperor of Rome. All because they said, we're not going to flee. We're not going to run. I wonder where they got such an idea. Is it possible that they read these same stories we did, that they heard reported out, hey, the one who is among you that is the greatest is not the one at the table, but the one who serves? The historian Seth Fabian, in talking about the Christian response to the plague, says this: the historical record makes very clear that Christians took up the obligations of love even in the most difficult and dangerous circumstances. Rather than abandoning the sick, Christians tended not only other Christians, but even pagans. In a pestilence that caused many to abandon those in need of help, Christians tending to the sick saved many lives. Basic care, bringing food and drink to the ill, saved many lives. It was precisely Christian love, not just of friend, but even of enemy, that proved the truth of Christianity to many Romans. And a lot of scholars say it was actually these two plagues that caused the most rapid growth of Christianity in the empire, even at a time where it was still considered illegal. Not because they voted God's man into office, not because they got the right people in the right seats in the Senate of Rome, not because they created alternative programs to compete with government programs, not because they all of a sudden created their own schools and took their kids out of the public schools. None of that. They served. They made themselves like the least. They made themselves like the servants. And in doing so, they so appealed to the hearts of the people of Rome that more and more said, I want to follow Jesus too. This is what happens when you take the words of Jesus seriously. This is what happens in the real world when you take the words of Jesus seriously. I find it interesting that I know so many people who are kind of right of center with their theology that say, I take the Bible literally, but seem to ignore the very concrete teachings of Jesus. And then I know friends who are a bit left of center theologically who want to just talk about metaphor and wisdom found in the text. And somehow they take these words of Jesus and just kind of form them back into this idea of establishing our own power to compete with the powers. And trust me when I tell you, I know it is tempting when someone punches you in the face to want to punch them back. I know it's tempting when someone lobs a verbal grenade at you to want to pick that thing up and throw it right back at them. I know it can feel really good to challenge power with more power. But in all of those circumstances, all we're doing is becoming a monster to defeat a monster. And here's what I know. Jesus pointed to a different way. The historian Rodney Stark says this about Christianity in its early days. He says, Christianity brought a new conception of humanity to the world. A new conception of humanity to the world. It brought a new idea of what would be possible. And it started with a very simple truth that the Christians preached that blew the minds of people in Rome. We love, they said, because God first loved us. I want to invite the band to come up as we conclude our time. I don't often stand on this platform and tell you something that I know for sure, or something that I'm 100% confident of. But I will tell you that I'll say this with more certainty than I've probably said anything ever while standing on this platform, is that Jesus pointed toward a different way than the games that we're taught to play each and every day in this empire in which we live. That Jesus pointed toward a different way that transcended all of the power games we're tempted to play. And he gave us a symbol of that. He took some bread and he took some wine and he said, this is my body and this is my blood. And do this to remember me. Participate in this to imitate me. And I think this is honestly the challenge of Eucharist. Is that on the night that Jesus was betrayed, when he took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, this is my body, he was giving it to the church, which is his body. That in the same way after supper, when he took the cup, and when he had blessed it, gave it to his disciples and said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this every time you drink it in remembrance of me. He was inviting us as the body of Christ to imitate him by being broken open and poured out for the world. To be those who position themselves as the least and as the servants. And I believe that this is the challenge of Eucharist. This is the question that Eucharist asks every single one of us every time we take the bread and the wine. It asks, do you believe this? Do you believe this? And this is what I invite us to contemplate as we get ready to participate together this morning. Here at Denver Community Church, we invite everyone to participate because this is not our table, it's Jesus' table. And so if you're willing, if you're ready, you may come. If you want to come to the middle, you can use the center aisle. If you want to go to the sides, you can come or use the side aisles and return to your seats using the diagonal aisles. All of the bread is gluten-free. We'd ask that you would take a piece and dip it in either the tall glass, which has wine, or the short glass, which has juice, as you hear the words, the body of Christ broken for you and the blood of Christ shed for you. For those of you who have children downstairs, if you would like them to participate with you, we invite you to go get them at this time. As together we respond to the question that Eucharist asks, do we believe the words of Jesus?